Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's story is not just another headline from a distant conflict zone. It is a warning about what happens when war, politics, climate pressure, and human survival collide. The title of this video says it all: Zero Day in Crimea, Water Collapse Sparks Mass Evacuation. What we are about to discuss is one of the most serious humanitarian and strategic crises to emerge from the Russia-Ukraine war, and it is unfolding right now in Crimea. For years, Crimea was portrayed as a secured, stabilized, and firmly controlled territory. But behind that image, a silent disaster has been growing drop by drop, reservoir by reservoir, pipe by pipe. Today, that disaster has a name: Zero Day. Zero Day means the moment when taps run dry, when reserves are gone, and when a society is forced to face a terrifying reality: there is simply no water left. Crimea is now standing at that edge. Water is not just a resource. It is life itself. Without water, cities do not function, hospitals shut down, agriculture collapses, and civilians are forced to flee. And in Crimea, more than 5 million people are now caught in a crisis that has moved beyond politics and entered the realm of survival. To understand how Crimea reached this point, we must go back in time. Before 2014, Crimea relied heavily on a single lifeline, the North Crimean Canal, which brought fresh water from the Dnipro River in mainland Ukraine. This canal supplied up to 85% of Crimea's fresh water, supporting agriculture, industry, and daily life. It was the backbone of the peninsula's existence. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, Ukraine shut off the canal. This was not an act of sudden aggression, but a strategic response. From that moment on, Crimea was cut off from its primary water source. Russia claimed it could solve the problem. Officials promised desalination plants, new reservoirs, pipelines, and advanced infrastructure. Year after year, these promises were repeated, but reality told a different story. Crimea's natural water resources are extremely limited. Rainfall is low, rivers are short and seasonal, and underground aquifers are fragile. Overuse of groundwater led to salinization, meaning seawater began contaminating fresh water reserves. Wells that once provided drinkable water turned brackish. Crops failed, soil degraded, villages began to struggle. For a while, emergency measures kept the system alive, water was rationed, supplies were redirected. Reservoirs were drained beyond safe limits, but these were temporary solutions to a long-term problem. Then came the war. In 2022, when Russian forces advanced into southern Ukraine, one of their first actions was reopening the North Crimean Canal. Water once again flowed into Crimea. Moscow declared the water crisis solved. State media celebrated it as a historic victory. But the solution did not last. As the war intensified, Ukrainian strikes targeted infrastructure across occupied territories. Pumping stations, power grids, pipelines, and reservoirs became vulnerable. At the same time, climate pressures worsened. Drought conditions expanded across southern Ukraine and Crimea. Reservoir levels dropped faster than expected. Maintenance became nearly impossible under constant threat. Slowly, quietly, the canal flow weakened again. Now, in recent months, multiple reports from inside Crimea indicate that water levels in major reservoirs have fallen to critically low levels. In some areas, they are approaching dead storage, the point where water can no longer be extracted. In cities like Simferopol, Sevastopol, and Kerch, residents report water being available for only a few hours a day, or not at all. This is what Zero Day looks like. Zero Day is not a metaphor. It is a technical term used by water experts to describe the moment when a city's water supply can no longer meet basic demand. When zero day arrives, authorities are forced to make impossible choices: shut down industries, evacuate neighborhoods, or abandon entire regions. And that is exactly what is happening now. According to emerging information, Russian installed authorities in Crimea have begun preparing evacuation plans. While these plans are not openly announced, signs are everywhere. Military families are being quietly relocated. Non-essential workers are encouraged to leave. Construction projects are frozen. Agricultural operations are scaled back or abandoned entirely. Water-intensive crops are gone. Factories are operating at minimal capacity. Hospitals are under pressure, forced to ration water for sanitation and medical procedures. Fire safety has become a nightmare, with limited water available to respond to emergencies. For civilians, daily life has turned into a struggle. Imagine waking up every day not knowing if water will flow from your tap. Imagine carrying buckets up staircases. Imagine choosing between cooking, washing, or drinking. Imagine living under military occupation while facing a basic survival crisis. This is the reality for millions in Crimea today. But this crisis is not only humanitarian, it is deeply strategic. Crimea is not just any territory, it is a symbol. For Vladimir Putin, Crimea represents power, control, and legacy. Losing Crimea, militarily or functionally, would be a devastating blow, and water, something so basic, has become one of his greatest vulnerabilities. An army cannot function without water. Bases, ships, airfields, and soldiers all depend on a stable supply. A civilian population in crisis cannot support long-term occupation. When people flee, when infrastructure collapses, control weakens. Water has become a weapon without a single shot being fired. Ukraine understands this reality. Water pressure is a form of leverage that does not require direct military confrontation. It exposes the limits of occupation. It forces the occupying power to spend massive resources just to maintain basic life. Russia, meanwhile, faces impossible choices. Building large-scale desalination plants in Crimea would take years, not months. Transporting water by ship or rail is expensive and unsustainable. Overpumping groundwater risks permanent environmental damage. Each option leads to long-term consequences, and time is not on Moscow's side. As zero day approaches, the political narrative begins to crack. State media tries to downplay the crisis, calling it temporary or manageable. But people on the ground see the truth. Social media posts, leaked videos, and eyewitness accounts paint a grim picture. Water trucks lining streets. Long queues, dry reservoirs, empty canals. The psychological impact is enormous. When people lose access to water, trust in authority collapses. Anger grows. Fear spreads, and in an occupied territory, that fear is magnified. The idea of mass evacuation, something once unthinkable, is now being whispered openly. Where would these people go? Mainland Russia is already struggling with economic pressure, sanctions, and internal strain. Absorbing millions of displaced people would be a logistical and political disaster. This is why Crimea's water crisis is often described as Putin's worst fear. It is not a dramatic battlefield defeat. It is something quieter, more devastating, and harder to control. A slow collapse driven by nature, infrastructure, and strategic reality. And the consequences do not stop at Crimea. A full-scale evacuation would reshape the war narrative. It would signal that Russia cannot sustain its grip on occupied territories. It would expose the weakness of long-term occupation without local cooperation and resources. Internationally, it would strengthen Ukraine's position. It would reinforce the argument that Crimea is unsustainable under Russian control. It would raise new questions about humanitarian responsibility and environmental damage. Even within Russia, the impact would be severe. Crimea has been presented for years as a success story, a symbol of national pride. A collapse there would shatter that image. Now, let's talk about the human cost. Behind every statistic is a family. Children growing up with water shortages, elderly people unable to carry heavy containers, farmers watching their land turn to dust, workers losing jobs as industries shut down. Water scarcity also increases health risks. Poor sanitation leads to disease. Hospitals under stress face infection risks. Fire hazards increase. Psychological stress skyrockets. This is not just a crisis. It is a slow-motion humanitarian disaster. And yet, the world is only beginning to pay attention. Most headlines focus on missiles, drones, and frontline movements. But history shows us that wars are often decided by logistics, resources, and sustainability. Armies fall not only because they are defeated, but because they can no longer feed, fuel, or supply themselves. Water is the most fundamental supply of all. Crimea's zero day is a reminder that control of land means nothing without control of resources. That occupation without sustainability is temporary. That nature itself can become a decisive force. As we speak, the situation remains fluid and dangerous. Authorities may attempt emergency measures. Weather patterns could shift slightly. Temporary relief might arrive, but the underlying problem remains unresolved. Crimea's water system is broken, and until that system is restored in a sustainable way, the threat of mass evacuation will continue to loom over the peninsula. So what happens next? Several scenarios are possible. Russia may invest enormous resources into emergency infrastructure, buying time but not solving the core issue. Ukraine may continue indirect pressure, accelerating the crisis. Climate conditions may worsen, pushing the system past the point of recovery. Or the crisis may force a political reckoning. History is filled with moments where basic necessities changed the course of empires. From ancient sieges to modern cities, water has always been a deciding factor. Crimea may soon join that history. One thing is certain: zero day is no longer a future threat. It is happening now. And as millions face uncertainty, the world must recognize that this crisis is not just about Crimea. It is about the consequences of war, the limits of power, and the reality that even the strongest leaders cannot command nature. If you found this analysis informative, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so more people understand what is really happening behind the headlines. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay safe, and we'll see you in the next video.